Hello, my dears. It's the middle of the day. It's just afternoon on the Friday, last day of the week, and my face is in shadow. I was going to say I'm afraid, but actually, how nice that you have seen quite enough of my face in the light that you don't need to be studying it in any more than you've already had to do so. So I thought I would just say a few words to you about Dante and Diderot for the exercise that you've been carrying out very well, which I call the meditation, which is not quite a contrast and compare and contrast, contrast and compare. It's really how can both of these people, these authors, these works, be counted pillars of the Western tradition? What sense does that make of a Western tradition? Well, in the case of Dante and Diderot, I want for a moment to stress the similarities, which is not normally the way I think you should approach it. But in this case, the similarities are so unusual and I think interesting that I think they are worth dwelling on. My thesis here is that there's a moment where modernity is launched in the Inferno, the first part of Dante's Commedia. And to the extent that it is launched, if you accept my thesis, that carries us straight through to Diderot, whose work of fiction was so modern that he didn't dare expose it to the censors, certainly, but he'd already had his problem with the church, with the censors exposing his encyclopedia to them and getting jailed, and so on. But the problem with his fiction was there are so many reasons why you wouldn't want to expose it to the public, and why it wasn't exposed, and why only after his death have we discovered that he was the author of one of the great masterpieces of fiction. So what I wanted to talk about for a bit, with your permission, for a short while, is the event at the end of Canto 5 of the Inferno, where the pilgrim, the observer, the tourist in hell, of course the tourist in hell is a quite other story if you've ever been to a vacation in which the hotel is not actually yet completed. But this is real hell. This is classical hell. This is Christian hell, and there's Dante being shown around by Virgil, who, by virtue of being dead, I guess, can pass through walls and knows everything, and can show our pilgrim around. And he's gripped by the sight of two people who are gripping each other, and nobody else in hell is enjoying much in the way of society. They're all socially distanced to the max. And he says, who are they? He's already fascinated because they present the silhouette of lovers, which indeed they were and are tormented, condemned to be so through all eternity, for having committed the sin of adultery, because one of them was already married, Francesca. And the reason that Dante is unable to take his eyes away from them turns out to be reinforced by the story that he is told. Actually, Francesca da Polenta is a distant relation, I think, of Dante's. But what strikes him, of course, is that his beloved, Beatrice Portinari, is herself married. And so he is a man lusting after a married woman, and here is a man and a woman, a married woman, condemned forever to eternal flames. And so the story, which Virgil tells, clarifies, is so deeply shocking to Dante the man on vacation from mortality, allowed this glimpse of the immortal world, that he can't remain in the frame. He can't remain telling the story. He weeps and faints dead away. And in doing so, I invite you to think, he gives the story back to itself. After all, it's his tale to tell, but he returns it to the tale because he has passed out. He isn't there to go on telling it. So it's the tale that must tell its own tale. And it's the tale, T-A-I-L, of that canto, because it can't go on. That's the end of that canto, because Dante is no longer there. Our author has gone. Now, the authorless story, although you might think this is a very ancient thing and applies to the Iliad, since we don't know who Homer was or how many people composed the Iliad and the Odyssey, and we certainly don't know who composed the Gilgamesh epic. There's no author. So you might say, well, we've already had authorless stories. Yes, we have, but in the later time, we do call it modern. We call Dante modern, and yet I think there is a further stage, basically a new level of modernity that arrives at the moment when the singer says, as it were, hold the phone. I was talking to my daughter about it, and she said it should be called Hold My Beer. I like that. Dante says to his tale, hold my beer, will you, while I pass out. That is the birth of the modern. And the modern, in a sense, in being born, creates a quantum mechanics of literature, or a quantum literature, which, as you may remember, involves the question, is this thing in front of us a point or a wave? And the answer is, it's both, and it depends where you're looking from. Are you looking back at it? Are you speculating? Hence the famous story of Schrodinger's cat, which is in a box. Is it alive or dead? Is it both, in effect? Because until we open the box, we don't know. So potentially, cat is both alive and dead, grey, black, white, any possible colour. We don't know. And this issue of what I'm calling quantum literature arises when, in much modern literature, the storyteller dies, but he can't or she can't. Because who's telling the tale then? Where are you telling this story from, you want to say to the author? And similarly, of course, in science fiction, where issues of time travel create almost impossible contradictions, destroying the present by intruding upon the past, and thus making the intrusion upon the past impossible because it couldn't happen without the present having given birth to the adventure. So these logical impossibilities, these quantum aspects of modern art, very important. They're keeping pace, in a sense, with science. And this is where I give it a quantum baptism, because I feel it is. And indeterminacy is, I think, at the heart of all great art. Contradiction, Schrodinger's cat again, indeterminacy, these are the building blocks of fiction. It's generally understood that science, on the contrary, is a matter of facts, facts upon facts, facts modifying facts, but continuing to be one fact after another. Of course, quantum science changes all that. And we don't have a mere succession of facts. We have an infinity of speculation. And if you accept what is now very much currently the belief of cosmologists, that there are an infinite number of parallel universes, then we are truly in the realm of fiction. And science is not the stern master that we believed, or stern mistress that we believed him or her to be. So here is fiction, in my view, giving birth to a new version of itself by allowing the storyteller, in a sense, to die. In a sense, there is a petit mort here, what the French call an orgasm, a little death. And there's something quite pornographic about, I feel, about Canto 5, at the end of Canto 5, when, in fact, the lovers are reading a pornographic account. They're, strictly speaking, not, but they're reading about lovers. They flush, they blush, and in picking up each other's inflamed imagination, they fall into each other's arms, and so they move into sin. And it's so delicious, the very phrase, and from that day we read no further, is so erotic and evocative that we too faint, dead away, with Dante. And Virgil is left thinking, damn, where did I put those smelling salts? And then if you think about Diderot, his extraordinary novel, which concerns two people. One of them is named, Jacques. We're very grateful for that. His master is not named. These two people on the road, arguing, remembering, encouraging each other, constantly returning to the issue of Jacques' amours in very much the same way that Lawrence Sterne kept returning to the loves of Uncle Toby, one of the main characters in Tristram Shandy, a book that hugely influenced Diderot, and from which he borrowed a little section for later on in the novel. And Tristram Shandy would have been another prop, another pillar of modernity to go to. But to ask you to read that book, it's bad enough that I should ask you to read Jacques, the Fatalist and his Master, which has other preoccupations that are not Sterne's, particularly the issue of whether things are written on high already. This is not something that concerns an Anglican vicar, such as Sterne was, but it does concern Diderot very much, and his book. So his book is almost obnoxiously modern, indeed postmodern, and infuriating as such, that the demands that we make of it, which it refuses to answer. But very much an heir to the end of Canto 5. Not at all an heir to the overriding meditation of the Divine Comedy, which is salvation. But remember that salvation is only achieved, and he takes the whole of the Divine Comedy to perceive this. It is the true story of the Divine Comedy. Salvation is only achieved by the storyteller for us, because he understands that la diritta via, the straight path that he mentions in the opening lines, has to go through the portal of renunciation. He never gets a date with his beloved Beatrice, but she is his guide, thereby, towards paradise. So, paradise, which, as I think it's Dr. Slop in Tristram Shandy who says, paradise is filled by virginity. Well, it seems to be so in the Divine Comedy, and Dante learns to surrender. Now, the first great moment of surrender is, of course, where he faints, at the end of Canto 5, actual physical surrender. What is required of us and of the pilgrim is a moral and imaginative surrender, whereby we understand that that is our route to paradise, is self-denial. Goethe says the same thing. Entbehren sollst du, sollst entbehren. Sacrifice, you must sacrifice. And that is, in the Faust, that is Goethe's recommendation. In Diderot, you are forced as the reader to surrender your desire to understand the point. What is the point? The same thing that has haunted people who experience Beckett's Waiting for Godot for the first time. So what's happening here? What does it mean? What does it mean? Why aren't we having this explained to us? Well, it begins really at the end of the Inferno, Canto 5, where Dante offers us a chance to understand that by giving away his story, by fainting, he gives it back to us. And also he gives the song to itself. And thus, I would argue, is modernity born in literature. This is a thought to carry with you and to carry away and drop straight into the bin, if needs be. Bin it. But it's my conclusion drawn after a lifetime of creating and thinking about literature, which doesn't make any of it intrinsically meaningful. However, it's the meaning that I've drawn. And I wish you well on this damp and chilly day. Stay inside, stay warm, eat a lot. I shouldn't be saying that, should I? But it's one of the joys of a lockdown. And be well. Goodbye for the moment, my dear.